across the country were calling it a turning point in American politics. What exactly did she say, and why did it leave even her enemies speechless? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room pulsed with quiet tension even before a single word was spoken. It was the kind of room where history didn't whisper. It waited to explode. Rows of lawmakers sat behind their nameplates like immovable statues, but their eyes darted, alert. The gallery overflowed with press, their fingers hovering above keyboards, cameras pointed like weapons, red tally lights glowing with expectation. On one end sat Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, arms crossed, jaw clenched, her presence radiating defiance, as if the entire proceeding were already beneath her. On the other stood Representative Jasmine Crockett, sharp, calm, unshakable, the kind of woman who didn't have to raise her voice to demand the room. At the center of it all stood Jasmine, framed by oak panels and years of struggle. She wore no armor, just a sharp navy suit and the quiet authority of someone who had seen justice denied too many times to flinch at power. Her voice when it came was even, firm-rooted in something deeper than statistics. "This is not about test scores," she began. "This is about zip codes that predict futures, about school buildings with mold on the ceilings and no heat in the winter, where teachers buy their own chalk and still get blamed when their students fall behind." Each sentence carved into the room like a chisel. She wasn't raising her voice, but she was raising the temperature of the truth, and it was starting to burn. Just as Jasmine moved to cite the federal allocation numbers, concrete, undeniable, irrefutable, a voice snapped through the air with the force of a thrown chain. "This is completely unprofessional." It was Marjorie Taylor Greene. She didn't look up from her seat. She didn't need to. Her words were designed not to debate, but to diminish. A calculated interruption, not of fact, but of presence. The moment she said it, the air changed. You could feel it. A hush, like a held breath, rippled through the room. One staffer's pen stopped mid-stroke. A Capitol intern dropped their eyes to the floor. Even the chair of the hearing froze for a heartbeat, hands poised above the gavel but unmoving. The microphones caught every syllable, crisp and sharp, like glass breaking in a library. Greene leaned back slightly in her chair, arms folded, wearing the satisfied smirk of someone who thought they just won a moment. But what she didn't realize, what no one realized yet, was that her words had lit a fuse, and Jasmine was still standing, untouched, unshaken, staring straight ahead, not blinking, not breathing heavy, just waiting. And when she finally moved, it wasn't to retaliate, it was to redefine the entire battlefield. Jasmine leaned forward just enough for the mic to catch her voice, though she could have whispered and the whole chamber would have heard her anyway. Her tone was measured, each word wrapped in restraint, but the fire behind it was unmistakable. "We'll address that with substance. No theatrics, no escalation, just a line of surgical calm delivered with the weight of centuries behind it." Her gaze didn't flinch, didn't wander. It locked straight ahead, not at Greene, but past her, through her, as if speaking to something older, larger, more poisonous than one woman's insult. She was standing in a room designed to break women like her, and yet her spine held straighter than the marble columns behind her. Around her, the air felt heavier, like the walls themselves knew what was coming next. She didn't raise her hand, but power gathered around her like a gathering storm, and in that moment, without raising her voice, Jasmine declared war on every room that ever told a black woman to sit down and smile. But while Greene reclined in smug satisfaction, the room itself began to shift, not from noise, but from eyes. She thought she had landed a winning blow. Her body language said it all, arms folded like a wall, chin tilted slightly back, the smug curl of her lips signaling that she believed she had just reduced a national conversation to a dismissive jab. Her supporters didn't cheer, but they didn't need to. The damage was meant to be quiet. It was meant to be felt, not heard. Somewhere across the room, a congressman in a gray suit leaned sideways and whispered to his colleague without taking his eyes off Jasmine. "She's about to blow. Just watch." There was no malice in his voice, only expectation, the same way someone watches a match hover over gasoline. But Jasmine Crockett didn't ignite. She didn't so much as raise a brow. Instead, her eyes began to move, deliberately one by one, scanning the faces around her with the cool precision of someone counting the seconds before gravity takes hold. She looked at the Democrats who shifted in their seats, unsure whether to speak or stay safe. She looked at Republicans who watched with crossed arms, their faces already shaped into indifference. She even looked toward the aides, young, tired, overworked, who knew exactly what had just happened, but were too junior to name it aloud. Her gaze didn't beg for permission, nor did it plead for understanding. It logged and measured, like a ledger, marking who saw her as a colleague and who saw her as a disruption. In the upper gallery, a young reporter lowered her phone for just a moment. Her breath caught. She leaned toward her editor and whispered the kind of sentence that travels faster than news itself. This is the moment. But it wasn't a moment of collapse. It was the moment just before the first drum of thunder hits the roof. Jasmine's right hand slowly reached for the edge of the desk in front of her. Not in desperation, but in control. She didn't grip it like she was drowning. She placed her fingertips there like an anchor. The wood beneath her palm was smooth, lacquered, but solid, like her. The cameras were still rolling, but she didn't look into them. She didn't need to. Her stillness was louder than Greene's words, her calm more violent than any insult. And somewhere between the silence and the restraint, something began to shift. Not in her, but in the room itself. The temperature dropped. The air became thick. The kind of pressure that comes before something changes. Not because someone shouts, but because someone doesn't. And in that moment, without a single raised voice, Jasmine Crockett made it clear. The storm wasn't coming. She was the storm. And just when the silence began to feel unbearable, like the whole room was waiting for permission to breathe, Greene opened her mouth again, pouring gasoline onto a flame she thought she had smothered. This woman has no respect for decorum. She's loud, unprofessional, and frankly, out of control. Greene's voice sliced through the air with theatrical cruelty, each word punctuated like a verdict being read aloud. She leaned forward now, amplifying her posture like a prosecutor making her closing argument. She didn't speak to Jasmine. She spoke about her, as if she weren't even in the room, as if she were just an exhibit to be examined. Her tone dripped with disdain, but worse than the insult was the casualness of it, the way it was spoken like a known truth, unchallenged and assumed. The words were meant to reduce Jasmine to a stereotype, to a threat, to the caricature of every angry black woman label ever wielded as a muzzle. Greene knew what she was doing. This wasn't about policy. This was about image, optics, power. Her voice echoed not with authority, but entitlement. Jasmine didn't respond immediately. She lifted her chin slowly, not out of defiance, but purpose. Her eyes locked on Greene, not with rage, but with the kind of clarity that cuts through noise like a scalpel through silk. The room, already heavy with tension, seemed to stop breathing entirely. No one dared move. You could hear the faint, mechanical whir of the cameras zooming in. Jasmine stepped forward just enough for her voice to carry, not only to Greene, but to everyone watching across the country. And then, without raising her tone, without blinking, she delivered a line that sliced the room in two. If truth makes me loud, then maybe silence is what made you acceptable. The impact was immediate and seismic. It didn't shout. It landed, like a pin dropping in a vault, like thunder cracking through marble. There was no applause, just silence, but not the silence of confusion. This was the silence of recognition, of witnesses who had just seen the mask slip, of people who realized in real time that two definitions of professionalism had just collided, one designed to maintain comfort and one meant to survive injustice. Jasmine's words were not for Greene. They were for every girl who had ever been told to lower her voice, every woman who had been called too much, every person of color who had been labeled a problem simply for not disappearing. She didn't need a mic drop. She didn't need to raise her voice. She was the voice. Greene's smirk faltered for the first time, not because she'd been shouted down, but because she hadn't. Because Jasmine's restraint wasn't a sign of submission, it was control. Total, devastating control. The kind that doesn't need to shout to command attention. Around the room, you could feel lawmakers shifting, not just in their seats, but in their understanding. What had started as a hearing had become something else entirely. A mirror, a battlefield, a confrontation between comfort and confrontation, between two worldviews, one that polices tone to avoid truth, and one that uses truth as the only tone it has left. And in the center of it stood Jasmine Crockett, still, unshaken, flame-eyed, and spine straight. She wasn't debating anymore. She was dismantling. She wasn't reacting. She was reframing the very terms of the conversation. And the tension didn't break. It crystallized. Because every single person in that room now knew they weren't just watching a clash between two politicians. They were watching a line drawn in the heart of power itself. And just when the silence seemed to stretch into eternity, Jasmine reached down, not for permission, but for evidence. The click of the remote was almost imperceptible, but its effect was immediate. Behind Jasmine, the projection screen blinked to life, casting cold light across the chamber. The title appeared in stark white against black. Unprofessional, a pattern of behavior by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, 2021 to 2024. No embellishments, no commentary, just the facts. The first video began playing, grainy Capitol security footage of Greene jabbing a finger into the chest of a uniformed guard, her voice raised, face flushed, mouthing words that didn't need audio to be understood. The next clip showed her interrupting a fellow congresswoman mid-sentence, loudly accusing her of being a Marxist plant during a veterans funding debate. Another cut to Greene laughing during a school shooting testimony, brushing aside a parent's tears with a dismissive wave. The room did not erupt. It tightened. Chairs creaked, throats cleared. One aide's hand flew up to their mouth. There was no narration. Jasmine let the images speak. Let Greene's own behavior roll out like a silent indictment, more damning than any speech. When the final clip ended, a moment where Greene yelled, "Shut your mouth," during a climate hearing, the screen froze. Jasmine didn't turn around. She faced the chamber, calm as ever, but now there was steel in her voice. Not fury, not revenge, precision. "Is this," she said slowly, "what professionalism looks like to you?" She didn't shout. She didn't sneer. She simply held up the very word Greene had weaponized against her and snapped it in half, cleanly, in front of the world. For a moment, no one moved. The sound of a paper shuffling in the back felt like thunder. Then, clap. Just one at first. From the back row. Then another. Louder. A ripple. Measured but defiant. The kind of applause that doesn't come from politeness, but from reckoning. The chair didn't bang the gavel, didn't interrupt. He simply stared ahead, fingers steepled beneath his chin, as if weighing something heavier than procedural decorum. Greene had gone silent, still seated, but suddenly small beneath the footage she couldn't erase. Jasmine remained standing, the remote still in her hand, but now it looked more like a weapon than a tool. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply let the silence settle. One not built from fear, but from realization. She had just reversed the mirror. Now Greene was the reflection, and it wasn't flattering. Around the room, the shift was palpable. Even those who had rolled their eyes earlier now sat straighter, stiffer. Not because they had changed sides, but because they realized they were being seen, not just by their colleagues, but by the millions watching beyond these walls. Jasmine hadn't called Greene names. She hadn't thrown a tantrum. She had done something far more devastating. She had documented her, named the behavior, presented it with surgical clarity, and in doing so, redefined the entire battlefield. No one interrupted her now. Not even Greene. Jasmine looked across the chamber and let the silence do the rest of the speaking. The message was clear. If the rules of decorum were going to be used as a noose, then she would make sure everyone saw who had been tightening it all along. And as the final slide faded to black behind her, it wasn't Jasmine's voice that echoed in the room. It was truth, unapologetic, undeniable, and absolutely professional. The applause had barely faded when Jasmine stepped forward, not to celebrate, but to finish what she started. She took one deliberate step toward the front of the chamber, not fast, not theatrical, just forward. Her heels clicked once against the marble, and somehow even that sound felt sharper than Greene's entire tirade. Her frame remained composed, but there was something unmistakably electric in the air now, like steel beginning to hum before a storm. She rested her hand lightly on the table, not for balance but for presence. Her voice when it came was low and smooth, almost too quiet for a room so heavy with attention. "You don't fear I lack decorum. You fear I don't ask for permission." The words landed like a flare in darkness, exposing not just Greene, but the entire system that had enabled her posture of mock authority. Jasmine's eyes didn't waver. She wasn't appealing to anyone. She was delivering testimony not to the lawmakers in front of her, but to the history she knew was watching behind them. And the silence that followed was different this time, less shocked, more reverent, because everyone sensed it. She wasn't done. She paused, not for effect, but for weight. Her shoulders stayed square, her breath measured. She didn't blink. And then she said, in a voice lined with years of restrained fire, 8 years ago, I was thrown out of a Texas courtroom for defending a black teenage boy who couldn't afford a lawyer." The words sliced the room open, slow, surgical, undeniable. No one shifted. No one dared. Jasmine continued, her tone steady, but something raw shimmered beneath it like molten metal barely contained. "They called me emotional, loud, and yes, unprofessional." She didn't flinch at the repetition. She owned it. Behind her, the congressional seal loomed large. But for the first time, it didn't look like a symbol of order. It looked like a cage. Jasmine let the sentence sit in the room like a courtroom transcript that couldn't be erased. She wanted them to feel it. Not just the words, but the burden they carried. And then she said what no record ever had the courage to document. "But they didn't include this in the transcript. He was innocent." Her voice didn't crack. It got colder, sharper. "And I stayed with him until he walked free." The weight of that line wasn't in the language. It was in the sacrifice it hinted at. The late nights, the closed doors, the stares, the threats, the rejection letters, the voicemails that started with "you people" and ended with nothing at all. But Jasmine said none of that. She didn't need to. Her silence between sentences said it for her. She stood there, black, female, fierce, and unbent, surrounded by the same walls that once would have called her out of order for breathing too loudly. Finally, she leaned in, just slightly, and delivered the line that would shatter the entire illusion of superiority still clinging to the edges of the chamber. "If that's what unprofessional means, then I'll wear it every day like a badge." The line didn't roar. It rang, like a verdict being read aloud. Like a bell tolling for every black woman who had ever been told to soften her edges, to round her truth, to make her fight more digestible. She didn't say it for Greene. She didn't say it for the cameras. She said it for the girl watching from a school desk in Mississippi, from a courtroom bench in Ohio, from a staffer's desk just outside that door, wondering if standing up would cost her everything. Jasmine made sure she had an answer. The room didn't erupt. It froze. It held, like a collective breath no one knew how to release. And in that stillness, Jasmine Crockett didn't just reclaim a word. She rebuilt its meaning, brick by brick, sentence by sentence, trial by trial. She didn't ask to belong. She forced the definition of belonging to catch up to her existence. In that moment, she wasn't unprofessional. She was unforgettable. And the silence around her wasn't absence. It was awe. But not everyone could stand still inside that silence, especially not the one it exposed. Greene's composure shattered like a cheap mask under pressure. Her voice tore through the chamber, loud, raw, and cracking at the edges. "You're twisting everything." It wasn't calculated anymore. It wasn't rhetorical strategy. It was panic disguised as anger, the kind that erupts when someone realizes they've lost control, not just of the room, but of the narrative. She slammed her palm against the desk so hard it echoed through the marble walls like a warning shot. But no one flinched. No one rushed to her defense. No one moved. The sharp smack of skin against wood felt less like power and more like a final gasp. Papers fluttered off the table. A water glass trembled near the edge. And the cameras, those ever-watchful cameras, zoomed in on her, unraveling, catching every breathless flinch and twitch of fury in 4K silence. Her voice had once dominated headlines. Now it simply bounced back, empty, off unmoved stone. She shoved back her chair, hard enough to screech against the floor, and rose with the rigid, frantic energy of someone not prepared to be seen, truly seen. Her eyes darted across the room looking for something, an ally, a signal, an exit. What she found instead was Jasmine Crockett, still standing, spine straight, shoulders set, not smug, just steady. Jasmine didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. Her face remained still, but her silence said everything. I don't need to chase you. You just told the world who you are. Greene's gaze faltered under that stillness, and for the first time in the hearing, her power shrank. Not because it had been taken, but because it had collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. Greene spun on her heel, every step across the polished floor louder than the last, like someone trying to stomp away from their own reflection. Each clack of her heels rang out with desperate punctuation. Retreat, retreat, retreat. Her fists were clenched at her sides, not in control, but in frustration. Fingers curled not around conviction, but around air. She pushed through the chamber doors without looking back, and they swung shut behind her with a muted, heavy thud, like the final page in a story that had ended, not with a triumph, but with a reckoning. Inside the room, no one applauded. No one moved. There were no dramatic gasps, no whispered commentary. Just breathe. The kind of collective exhale that only comes when a storm has passed, not the kind that rattles windows, but the kind that reveals what the wind tried to hide. And in the center of it all, Jasmine Crockett remained exactly where she had always been. Not elevated, not defiant, but anchored. She didn't chase. She didn't shout. Because sometimes in rooms built to exclude you, the most radical thing you can do is stay and let them walk out. The echo of the chamber doors closing behind Greene hadn't even faded before something far rarer than outrage stirred in the room. Conscience. At first there was only silence, the kind that hangs heavy after something unspoken finally breaks into the open. But then quietly, almost reluctantly, a Republican congressman stood. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't clear his throat for drama. He simply rose slowly, as if the weight of the moment pressed on every joint. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried. It cut clean through the tension, like a thread pulled tight. This chamber owes Representative Crockett more than silence. It wasn't a flourish. It wasn't a political move. It was what happens when someone realizes that neutrality, in a room built on injustice, is just another form of surrender. The gallery didn't erupt, but every eye in the room turned, because in a place addicted to spectacle, integrity was rare enough to sound like thunder. Across the aisle, a lone independent lawmaker leaned forward, his pen tapping once against the folder before him. He flipped it open, spoke into the mic without waiting for permission, and introduced language for a new rules amendment, a ban on veiled personal attacks, coded slurs, and weaponized decorum. He didn't say Greene's name, but he didn't have to. Everyone knew. The suggestion wasn't radical, it was overdue. But what made it seismic was the timing, not whispered in committee or buried in red tape, but dropped like a stone into the still surface of a live hearing that had just become something far larger than its agenda. A procedural motion had never felt so much like a moral declaration. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained standing, not triumphant, not smug, but composed, like the eye of the storm refusing to move even as the system shifted around her. Her arms stayed at her sides, her breathing never quickened, but her presence filled the room more powerfully than any outburst ever could. She didn't need to smile. She didn't need to speak, because the truth didn't need decoration. It only needed daylight. And that's what she had delivered. She had exposed not just a person, but a pattern. Not just a comment, but a culture. And the room, finally quietly, had started to listen. In the days and weeks that would follow, the headlines would focus on the footage, the fallout, the political implications. But those who were in the room that day would remember something else. They would remember the moment when power didn't roar, but stood still. They would remember a woman who didn't raise her voice, but raised a mirror. And they would remember the silence that finally gave way, not to applause, but to accountability. Jasmine didn't win because she dominated. She won because she endured, because she refused to sit down, soften, or shrink, because she met power with presence, not volume. And in a chamber that had spent decades defining professional as polished compliance, she redefined it in real time as truth spoken without permission. And as the hearing adjourned with no gavel strike, no curtain drop, just the quiet reshaping of the room itself, the real storm was only beginning, and this time, it wasn't confined to four walls. Within hours, the footage hit every screen in America. First, it spread quietly, shared by aides, journalists, and students who had watched the hearing live. Then it detonated. Edits were clipped, captions added. Loops of Jasmine Crockett's steady voice facing down fury replayed across TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. News anchors interrupted scheduled coverage to rerun the moment Greene stormed out. But more importantly, the moment Jasmine didn't move. The clip of her declaring, "If that's what unprofessional means, then I'll wear it every day like a badge," amassed over 30 million views in 2 days. But the internet didn't just watch it, they responded. Within 48 hours, the hashtag number redefining professional surged to the top of global trends. It wasn't just a trend, it was a reckoning, a movement, a call. Black women across professions began sharing their own stories of being told to smile more, of being called aggressive for speaking directly, of being passed over for not being a culture fit. Lawyers posted clips of Jasmine's speech next to their own courtroom transcripts. Teachers pinned her quotes on classroom walls. Nurses, journalists, corporate analysts, flight attendants, coders, baristas, people in every walk of life began using the hashtag to reclaim a term that had long been used to gatekeep, exclude, and silence. Jasmine hadn't just spoken truth to power, she had redefined what power could look and sound like. For the first time, professional wasn't being measured in posture or tone, but in courage, in clarity, in how much of yourself you refuse to shrink. Universities took notice. Invitations flooded her inbox. From Yale, Georgetown, Stanford, Howard. Panels were rearranged. Entire symposiums were reframed around her testimony. At Harvard Law School, a class canceled its lecture just to watch the hearing replay in full, frame by frame. CNN booked her for a primetime segment where she sat alone in a minimalist studio, no flag behind her, no podium, just a single camera and a chair. The host asked her what she thought professionalism truly meant, now that her face had become its most debated definition. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She looked straight into the lens and said, "Professionalism is not submission. It's conviction." The line rolled through the country like a second shockwave. Clips of that one sentence hit 1 million shares before the segment had even finished airing. It became a slogan, a t-shirt, a protest sign, a pinned tweet. But more than that, it became a mirror. Because as people watched Jasmine stand her ground, watched her silence a room without shouting, watched her face down condescension without ever lowering her gaze, they saw more than a congresswoman. They saw themselves. The teenager told to speak softer in debate club. The job applicant told her natural hair was distracting. The young man passed over in meetings, then asked to lead diversity training. The professor who had to defend her tone more often than her thesis. The mother who had to fight for her child's IEP in a district office filled with closed smiles. They all saw her, not as a symbol, but as proof. Proof that you could hold the line, proof that you could be calm and still be fierce, that you could be composed and still burn down a system with truth alone. And so the clip kept playing, not because it was trending, because it was needed, because sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do isn't to scream or storm, but to stay, to speak, and to make silence your stage. Jasmine Crockett had done just that, and a nation finally stopped talking long enough to listen. And after days of headlines, interviews, and a nation shaken by a single moment of stillness, Jasmine returned, not to relive the battle, but to deliver its final word. She stepped back into the same hearing room where it all began. Same marble floor, same oak-paneled walls, same ceiling that once felt too heavy to stand under. But something was different now. Not the architecture, not the lighting. It was the air. It no longer resisted her presence. It made room for it. Lawmakers straightened when she walked in, not from protocol, but from something closer to awareness. Her heels didn't echo, they declared. She moved to the front not like someone revisiting a memory, but like someone fulfilling a sentence that had waited too long to be spoken. She carried no stack of papers, no binder, just her voice. And when she stood behind the microphone, there was no tremor in her breath, no hesitation in her shoulders. She paused, not for silence, but to let the weight settle. Then, with the same calm that once disarmed a chamber mid-attack, she spoke. "If being professional means knowing my plate," she began, her eyes sweeping the room with quiet defiance, "then I'll proudly be unprofessional." The line didn't just land, it detonated. It sliced clean through the legacy of every closed-door meeting where that word had been used to shut someone like her out. Through every performance review coated with dog whistles, through every hallway whisper about who didn't fit the culture. It exposed professionalism not as a standard, but a script. And Jasmine had just torn it up, live, in the very place that wrote it. For a second, there was no response. No one moved, not because they didn't hear her, but because they did. Every syllable, every unspoken history underneath it. The stillness was not resistance, it was surrender. And then, like the final tremor after an earthquake, the applause erupted. Not polite, not restrained. It broke like a dam. From every corner of the room, hands came together with the urgency of something long overdue. Some stood, some didn't. But every clap sounded like more than agreement. It sounded like release. The kind that only comes when a room has been holding its breath for too long. There were no chants, no signs, just raw, open sound, honest, loud, unashamed. And still, Jasmine didn't smile. Her face remained steady, her eyes locked forward. Not cold, just clear. Because this wasn't about celebration. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reality finally being spoken so plainly, so powerfully, that even the walls had no choice but to listen. The camera zoomed in, slow, deliberate. Not on the crowd, not on the chair's gavel, but on Jasmine. Her expression didn't shift with the roar behind her. She didn't beam or blink back tears. Her lips remained pressed in quiet resolution, her brow unmoved. And in that moment, every viewer watching at home saw something undeniable. She had not won because her opponent collapsed. She had won because she never did. She had withstood what was meant to belittle her, contain her, break her, and she had done it without screaming, without flinching, without surrendering a single inch of her integrity. The power of the moment wasn't in her volume. It was in her refusal to be silenced. Behind her, a few aides wiped their eyes. Some lawmakers leaned in toward each other, whispering thoughts they weren't yet brave enough to speak aloud. One reporter lowered her notepad and simply watched, no longer documenting, just witnessing. The applause continued, rolling and receding like waves, but Jasmine never lifted her arms to acknowledge it. She didn't soak it in. She didn't need to, because she hadn't come for applause. She had come for closure, for clarity, and for every person who had ever been told their voice didn't belong in rooms like this. She gave them proof. She had walked into a chamber designed to drain dignity from people like her. She had stood under lights meant to expose weakness, not truth. She had faced down interruptions, insults, and centuries of coded expectations, without ever becoming what they accused her of being. And when the moment came to define who she was, she didn't point fingers. She didn't shout anyone down. She redefined the word they had tried to weaponize, and she did it in their own language, in their own house. And now as she stood there, camera lens focused so tight the world could count her breath, she didn't just look like the future. She looked like justice finally finding its voice. The applause inside the chamber didn't stop quickly. It didn't fade politely. It swelled, then held. A rolling tide of recognition, not for drama, but for truth. But Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her hand, didn't gesture for more. She remained motionless behind the microphone, her eyes steady, her jaw still set with the resolve that had carried her through every second of that hearing. She had spoken her final line not as a flourish, but as a declaration carved in steel. "I'll proudly be unprofessional." She didn't look like a woman who had won. She looked like a woman who had nothing left to prove. Outside the building, however, something else was happening, something harder to track, more explosive than anything within the room. The live streams had ended, but the clips had already begun to move, like electricity on an open wire, like a pulse breaking loose across a network built to contain, but never control, emotion. On social media, within 15 minutes of her closing statement, the hashtag number #RedefiningProfessional was trending globally. Within an hour, it was etched onto handmade cardboard signs in New York subways, college campuses in Los Angeles, coffee shop chalkboards in Austin, and office Slack threads in Chicago. People weren't just reposting Jasmine's speech, they were pairing it with their own stories. A nurse in Atlanta posted, "They said my braids weren't professional. I wore them anyway." Redefining Professional, a black woman in London, added, "They said I spoke too directly in meetings. I just got promoted." Redefining Professional, a 17-year-old high school debater, wrote, "They said my voice was too deep for public speaking. I just got into Stanford." Redefining Professional, within 24 hours, Jasmine's words had ceased to be a moment. They had become a mirror, and millions of people were finally seeing themselves in it. In a university lounge at Spelman College, a group of students sat around a cracked laptop watching the replay of the hearing. No one spoke for the first 10 minutes. Then one woman said, "I've been called that exact word, unprofessional, by a man who never remembered my name." Another nodded, eyes locked on the screen, voice flat. "They used that word to shut me down when I challenged our department's lack of diversity." Another, "It's not a word, it's a muzzle." But something was different this time. As they watched Jasmine stand, not yelling, not folding, just standing, something in them unlocked. The word no longer belonged to their supervisors, professors, or critics. It had been taken back, redefined, out loud, on the record. That same afternoon in an elementary school in Detroit, a fifth-grade teacher paused the lesson and played a short clip of Jasmine's speech on the projector. She didn't explain it, just let the children hear the cadence, the calm, the fire inside the words. One student, barely 10, whispered to his friend, "She sounds like my mom when she's fighting the school for my IEP." Another girl looked up and said softly, "She talks like me." Like she's not sorry. The teacher didn't cry until later, in the break room, after the students had gone to recess. That was when she texted her sister, "Our voice sounds different when it's not apologizing for existing." Newsrooms scrambled to keep up. CNN edited the full hearing into a special segment before nightfall. MSNBC ran a primetime panel titled, "The Power of Standing Still: Why Jasmine Crockett Broke the Internet." Even usually conservative outlets were forced to acknowledge the scale of the moment, not because they agreed, but because their viewers were already asking, what exactly did she say? But no one said it better than Jasmine herself when she appeared the next night, unscripted, alone, on a CNN special hosted by Abby Phillip. In a studio stripped of fanfare, Jasmine sat across from the host, back straight, eyes focused. There were no dramatic cuts, just two women, one camera, and a single question. "Congresswoman Crockett, what does professionalism mean to you now?" Jasmine paused only a second, then said, "Professionalism is not submission. It's conviction." The feed cut to silence. Abby didn't speak. The control room didn't add music. There was no panel to comment afterward. Just the image of Jasmine, steady and still, her voice echoing through every living room like a bell tolling over a quiet city. That clip, 38 seconds long, was viewed over 50 million times in less than 2 days. Back in her district office in Texas, Jasmine received over 10,000 emails in 72 hours. Most didn't begin with "Dear Representative." They began with "Thank you." A woman who had left law school 10 years earlier because a professor told her she lacked polish wrote, "I'm reapplying." A transgender man who had been let go from his first job for inappropriate tone wrote, "You made space for me, and I've never met you." A father who had watched the hearing with his daughter wrote, "She asked me if she could be loud when she knows she's right. I told her yes, and I have you to thank." This wasn't virality. This was velocity, movement, culture bending, language being reclaimed in real time. And Jasmine? She didn't go on a victory tour. She didn't hold press conferences or post selfies with talking heads. She went back to work, quietly, purposefully, because she knew the real change hadn't happened when she spoke, but when other people started speaking because of her. And she knew applause is loud, but transformation is slow. So she let the echo live on its own, knowing that the most powerful line she ever delivered was the one people now whispered to themselves in boardrooms, in classrooms, and in mirrors. If being professional means knowing my place, then I'll proudly be unprofessional. And from that moment forward, no one could ever use that word the same way again. The flood didn't just wash over the people, it reached the powerful too. And for many of them, it came like a cold slap in a room they thought they owned. Inside the Capitol, Jasmine's testimony had landed like a precision strike. But what followed wasn't an explosion. It was slower, colder, and far more devastating. It was accountability. And it moved through the marble corridors of power like smoke through air vents. Inescapable, untraceable, and impossible to ignore. The first sign came not from her supporters, but from those who had remained stone-faced during the hearing. A Republican congressman from Ohio, who had spent most of Jasmine's testimony checking his phone, released a carefully worded statement 3 days later. "While I may disagree with Representative Crockett's positions, I recognize the validity of her call for decorum to be applied fairly." It was soft, toothless. But in D.C., even a mild acknowledgement can feel like a collapse. Others were not so lucky. An anonymous staffer from Greene's office leaked internal memos to a political blog, emails that showed Greene's team had planned the interruption days in advance. Subject line, "Handle Crockett before she builds steam." One of the messages referred to Jasmine as a tick-tock trap waiting to happen. Another line read, "We poke. She explodes. She loses." But she hadn't exploded. She had stood. And now the receipts were public. Within hours, the leak was verified by major outlets. The story made front-page headlines. Marjorie Taylor Greene plotted disruption of Jasmine Crockett. Hearing backfires nationally. Editorial boards that had remained neutral began scrambling for position. The New York Times published a rare op-ed titled, "The Weaponization of Decorum: How Congress Has Used Civility to Silence Women." The Washington Post ran a front-page headline, "Crockett was interrupted. She interrupted a culture." And in offices around the Hill, people who had once laughed quietly into their sleeves now stared at closed doors and blinking phones. One senator's aide whispered, "She changed the temperature of the building." Another, a junior policy advisor, told a colleague in the hallway, "This is the first time I've seen people afraid of being called out without being yelled at." But it wasn't fear, it was exposure. The House Oversight Committee, the very body where Jasmine had been attacked, suddenly found itself under the microscope. Civil rights groups demanded a full audit of past interruptions and conduct violations in hearings. In the span of 5 days, over 200 clips were pulled from C-SPAN archives. A pattern emerged, and it was damning. Interruptions of female representatives, disproportionately high. Interruptions of women of color, off the charts. One clip showed Greene interrupting Representative Ayanna Pressley mid-sentence. Another revealed a Republican lawmaker sighing and rolling his eyes every time Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez opened her mic. A new montage was born, not created by activists, but by a data journalism unit at a major network. Its title, "Silencing in Real Time." Suddenly, those who had dismissed Jasmine's moment as emotional theatrics were forced to answer for their own records. And the hearings didn't stop. Neither did Jasmine. 2 days after the CNN interview, she returned to the Capitol. Not for interviews, but for work. The same hallways, the same carpet. The same men who once brushed past her now made awkward eye contact in elevators. Some even nodded. A few apologized, not in public, but in low voices when no camera was present. It wasn't about regret, it was about self-preservation, because what Jasmine had done was bigger than one exchange. She had shifted the margins of what was acceptable and made silence look like guilt. On the seventh day after the hearing, a vote was held, a symbolic one called by an independent member to propose a reform in the committee's procedural guidelines. The proposal was simple: ban the use of identity-coded language as personal attacks. Phrases like "you people," "angry," "out of control," "loud," when used without relevance to policy, would be ruled as violations. During the discussion, several members who had previously sided with Greene remained silent, but one, a conservative moderate from Arizona, stood and said something no one expected. "I came here thinking the word unprofessional was harmless. Last week I watched it used like a blade, and I watched someone stand through it without bleeding. That changed something in me." The resolution passed, not unanimously but powerfully. It wasn't just about rules, it was about acknowledgement, about the fact that words aren't neutral when they're designed to wound without leaving visible scars. Jasmine never claimed victory. She never took a victory lap. She let the truth do that for her. And yet, her influence echoed in the most unlikely places. A former Republican press secretary posted a thread on X, formerly Twitter. "I helped write talking points to call people like Jasmine divisive. I was wrong. I see it now. She didn't divide, she revealed." Cable news began referring to her exchange as a turning point in legislative culture. Scholars began to cite it in classrooms. One political science professor at Yale opened his lecture by playing Jasmine's full speech and asking the class, "Where does professionalism end and power begin?" Even in Greene's own district, the backlash had begun. Town halls were no longer entirely friendly. Voters asked questions. Women stood up and asked her to explain herself. One even wore a shirt that said, "Loud, unapologetic, unbroken." The old playbook, interrupt, enrage, discredit, had failed, and in its place stood a new archetype: steady, honest, undeniable. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her fist. She didn't slam the desk. She didn't walk out. She stayed. She stood. She spoke. And now even those who once smirked behind closed doors were saying her name, not because they had changed their values, but because she had forced them to change their behavior. This wasn't justice delivered by applause. This was a reckoning written in real time, in transcripts, in rules, in rewired minds, and it had only just begun. It didn't happen in a flash of lights or behind a podium. There was no banner, no confetti, no official proclamation, but a symbol had been born. 7 days after the hearing, Jasmine Crockett stood in a modest gymnasium in the 5th Ward of Houston. It was the kind of space where folding chairs always outnumbered working microphones, where the heat clung to your skin, no matter how many fans clicked overhead. There were no press passes, no handlers, just kids, about 200 of them, stuffed into plastic seats, backpacks under chairs, eyes shifting between curiosity and quiet awe. No one there cared that her face had been on CNN. They hadn't come for the soundbite. They'd come because someone had finally made the word professional sound like something they could touch. Jasmine didn't walk to the front like a politician. She walked like a teacher. No teleprompter, no written speech, just her voice, her feet, and the weight of everything she'd carried into that moment. She began simply. "I wasn't invited here to lecture you," she said, pacing slowly in front of the first row. "I'm not here to tell you to behave. I'm here to tell you what they mean when they say that word, professional." She paused. "Because they'll use it on you." The room held still. Even the squeak of sneakers and shifting backpacks faded away. "They won't always throw chairs at you," Jasmine continued. "They won't always curse you out loud. Sometimes they'll just call you unprofessional and wait for you to believe it." A slow hush overtook the gym. Eyes widened. Posture straightened. They'll tell you your braids are distracting, that your voice is too loud, that your questions are too sharp, that your confidence makes people uncomfortable. They won't say the real words. They'll say, "Not a good fit, needs polish, doesn't carry herself the right way." She stopped, dead center under the basketball hoop, and looked every student dead in the eye. They will not always hit you, but they will measure you, slice by slice, until you stop showing up as yourself. Then she smiled, not the practiced smile of a candidate, the quiet, knowing smile of someone who had walked through the fire and kept walking. And when they do that, you don't yell, you don't cry. She leaned forward just slightly. You say, noted. Now watch me do it anyway. The gym didn't erupt. It transformed. Because it wasn't a rally. It was a passing of the torch. Later that night, Jasmine sat on a worn metal bench behind the school with the principal and 3 teachers. The sun was sliding low, casting burnt orange shadows across the asphalt. She got through to them, one of the teachers said. I've been trying to teach them about resilience all year, and she did it in 8 minutes. The principal nodded slowly, still watching the empty court. It's not the words, Ernie said. It's the fact she didn't flinch. Jasmine, still holding a water bottle from the gym, didn't respond right away. She just stared out at the playground. I flinched once, she said quietly. 8 years ago, when a white judge called me loud and asked if I had ever taken a breath before speaking. I smiled and said thank you. She exhaled. I've been mad at myself ever since. She looked at the principal then, her voice firmer. So now I don't smile, not unless I mean it. Across the country, the impact deepened. In a university women's studies class in North Carolina, Jasmine's hearing was now part of the syllabus. The course title was updated to include a new module, Language, Power, and the Silent Rebellion. In a courtroom in Oakland, a public defender cited her in a closing argument about bias and how tone is policed. A black professor in Kansas walked into her first faculty meeting of the semester with a tote bag that read, "Proudly unprofessional." When asked about it, she simply replied, "If you know, you know." The movement had evolved beyond Jasmine. She had become a vessel, not because she asked to be one, but because the culture needed one. Art students painted murals, activists printed buttons, high school students quoted her in commencement speeches. But none of it looked like hero worship. It looked like people finally hearing themselves in a voice that didn't apologize. Then came the moment no one expected. 3 weeks after the hearing, Jasmine was invited to deliver the closing keynote at a judicial ethics symposium in New York City, an event that historically had never once featured a woman of color as a headliner. She almost declined. It's not my crowd, she told her staff. They're not coming to hear me. They're coming to feel less implicated. But after a long silence, she agreed. The hall was high-ceilinged, the chairs velvet, the audience filled with judges, law professors, and veteran attorneys. Most of them white, most of them male, many of them skeptics. Jasmine walked to the podium, no script in hand. I've been asked to speak today about what it means to uphold the law, she began. But I think we need to talk about what it means to be heard in rooms where law is shaped. She spoke for 12 minutes. She never raised her voice. But by the end, no one looked away. Her closing line? The law should not require silence to be taken seriously. The room stood, not out of politics, but out of reckoning. By then, the movement had taken on a life of its own. Jasmine didn't need to push it. She didn't need to trend. Her words lived in the marrow of those who had once been measured in silence. She hadn't just redefined a word. She had rewritten what it meant to belong without asking. And that is how a legacy begins. Not with statues or slogans, not with a headline, but with a moment where someone finally refuses to bend, and others realize they never had to either. And as the world echoed with her words, as silence cracked and definitions crumbled, one truth stood taller than any headline. This was never just about one woman. There are moments that make noise, and then there are moments that leave marks. Jasmine Crockett's stand did both. But in the end, the sound faded. The headlines rolled on. What remained was something deeper, a scar that taught, not just hurt. And that scar became a question we all had to confront, whether seated in Congress or behind a checkout counter, whether teaching classrooms or surviving them. Who gets to define what power looks like, and why have we let them do it for so long? This story wasn't about a clash of politics. It was about proximity to pain, about how close someone has to get to injustice before they're labeled unprofessional for naming it. Jasmine didn't walk into that hearing to fight. She walked in to speak. And the moment she spoke plainly, calmly, without bowing her head or softening her truth, the room turned on her, not with violence, but with a quieter, crueler force: decorum. A word that pretends to be neutral, when in reality it is always bent toward comfort, but never hers. That's the heart of it. This wasn't a story about civility. It was a story about control. And in that story lies the lesson. We live in a world where some people's fire is called passion, and others is labeled aggression, where assertiveness on one tongue is leadership, and on another it's threat. Jasmine didn't break the rules. She revealed how those rules were written to break her. That's what made it radical. That's what made it necessary. She forced us to see what it looks like when a system designed for compliance is confronted by someone who knows their worth too deeply to shrink. She didn't just fight back. She made stillness an act of resistance. She made a calm tone feel like a revolution. And in doing so, she reminded us of a truth far older than Congress, older than microphones, older even than law. Power is not about volume, it's about conviction. But the greater truth, the one harder to digest, is that we helped build the world that tried to silence her. Every time we laughed when a woman was called too much, every time we didn't speak up when someone was interrupted, every time we nodded when someone told us she'd be easier to work with if she smiled more, these weren't small moments, they were bricks. And the walls they built have kept out more truth than any policy ever could. Jasmine didn't dismantle that wall in one day, but she cracked it, and now it leaks. Now we know that silence is not neutrality, it's complicity. That professional should never mean invisible. That rules written without us were never meant to protect us. That we do not owe our dignity to the comfort of others. And now we know this too. The quietest room can become the loudest battlefield. The most dangerous word isn't shouted, it's whispered. And the strongest weapon a woman can wield is simply standing her ground and refusing to ask for permission. So what is the lesson? That change doesn't come when we scream louder. It comes when we speak without apology, when we name the wound and hold the stare, when we remind the world that there is no wrong way to be honest, no wrong tone for truth, no wrong volume for dignity. Jasmine Crockett reminded us of all of that, and now the only question left is, when it's your turn to speak, will you lower your voice to be accepted, or will you stand up, breathe in, and let the room adjust to your presence? And now that the lesson has been carved into the walls of Congress and whispered into the hearts of millions, the silence is broken, but the responsibility remains. This moment was never meant to be an ending. Jasmine Crockett didn't endure humiliation so we could be inspired for a weekend and then return to our routines. Her strength was not a performance, it was a provocation, and her words weren't a message to be admired. They were a command, a demand, a flare fired into the night sky, telling all of us who have ever been silenced, minimized, interrupted, or labeled, you are not wrong for being loud. You are not dangerous for being sharp. And you are not unprofessional for being unapologetically yourself. So what do we do with that fire? We do not sit still. We do not repost and move on. We build. We confront. We transform every room Jasmine stood in into a room that listens differently the next time we enter it. Because this fight, the one she lit from a single microphone, is not over. It never was. It lives now in every hallway conversation where a woman is told to soften her voice before her idea is heard, in every teacher evaluation where tone is ranked higher than content, in every job interview where black hair is coded as not polished, in every courtroom, boardroom, classroom, break room, and living room where someone with power uses the word professional not to invite, but to exclude. This is where the real test begins. You want to honor Jasmine? Don't clap. Don't quote her. Do what she did. When the easy thing is silence, speak. When the polite thing is to excuse it, name it. When the safe thing is to avoid it, step into it. And when the powerful call you unprofessional, make that the badge you wear into battle. Because if Jasmine's stand taught us anything, It's that you don't have to shout to shake the system. You don't have to scream to split the truth wide open. Sometimes all it takes is standing so still that the room finally hears what it's been trying to ignore. But standing still doesn't mean standing alone. Yes, you reading this are standing in a room too. Right now. Maybe it's virtual. Maybe it's cultural. Maybe it's at your workplace or your school or your dinner table. Maybe it's the quiet moment when your boss mispronounces your name for the fifth time. Maybe it's the team meeting where someone says, "Let's keep this civil," right after you tell the truth. Maybe it's the friend who rolls their eyes when you say racism isn't subtle. It's systemic. In those moments, you will be tempted to shrink, to smile and stay palatable, to smooth your truth into something digestible. Don't stand. Not for drama, not for revenge. Stand because the ground beneath you was already earned by someone else's defiance. Stand because someone in that room needs to see it's possible. Stand because silence has never saved anyone, but truth, when spoken boldly, has moved nations. Jasmine Crockett didn't burn down the hearing room. She didn't need to. She became the match and dared the world to catch fire. Now it's your turn. Ask yourself, what will I do the next time someone uses tone to dismiss truth? What will I say when someone mistakes power for threat? What will I risk to make one more room safe for someone who speaks like me, looks like me, dares like me? Because there is no neutral here. You're either the silence or you're the signal. So speak up, not because it's easy, but because it's right. Disrupt, not because you want attention, but because injustice deserves none. Be unprofessional, if professional means quiet while others are erased. Be out of line, if the line was drawn to keep you out. Be too much, if being less means watching people suffer in polite silence. And if they try to shame you with that word, like they did to her, if they tell you to fall in line, calm down, speak softer, sit back, look them dead in the eye, smile if you must, and say, "I won't lower my voice just to be tolerated. I will raise it until I am heard." Then stand, even if your knees shake, even if your voice cracks, even if the room rolls its eyes or shifts uncomfortably in its seats. Because somewhere out there, another person is watching, maybe younger than you, maybe braver than you, maybe more scared than you, and they're waiting to see what you'll do. So show them what Jasmine showed you. That being unprofessional isn't the insult, it's the invitation to rebuild everything that tried to erase you, to reclaim every word that was used against you, to rise and make the room listen, whether it wants to or not. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.